Welcome to Security Weekly's Virtual Hacker Summer Camp 2020. I am your host, Matt Alderman, and joining me for this interview segment is Jeff Capone. He is the co-founder and CEO of Secure Circle. Welcome, Jeff.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Now, we're going to talk one of my favorite topics. A lot of people know I'm an app user data guy. I always make this statement that, look, the three types of security controls that transcend anything we're doing from a digital transformation will be application, user, and data. And what I love about what you guys are doing is really the focus on the data side. And so give us a little overview initially of who's Secure Circle and what do you guys do?
Sure. So Secure Circle is a data security company, and we focus primarily on data. And what we like to say is we protect data at scale. And what that means really is without limitation. No limitation on applications that can use the data, and no limitation on the type of endpoints that have the data stored, no limitations on the user experience, no limitations on performance. So literally protect everything you want to protect without limitations. And there's a lot of great byproducts. Literally fundamental changes can happen when you start doing things like being able to protect data at scale. And I'd love to dig in a little bit deeper on that.
Yeah, I mean, most of us would know data protection from the concept of data loss prevention. DLP has been the predominant technology in this space, but there's limitations with DLP. I think a lot of people have experienced some of these limitations with their DLP solutions. I know a number of CISOs that I've talked to have been kind of frustrated with how effective DLP is. So what's the difference in what Secure Circle does versus what a traditional DLP does first? And then we can dig in maybe into some of the other specifics.
Right. No, it's a perfect question. And it all comes back to once you can do things at scale, the paradigm changes. So if you think about, in general, security models, forget about data security, just think of any app security, just think of security in general. Security has some default mode of operation, and then there's an exception. So security is typically managed by exception. And if you think about what happens in most security postures, the default behavior is to protect or block, and the exception to the rule is to allow, right? So you're always in a mode where everything is protected by default or everything is blocked by default, and then the exception is to allow. I mean, if you think about even just back in the days when firewalls first came out, you were actually just trying to block sites. You just go through your website and block. And that just became an endless battle. You didn't know where to plug. New sites would come up. You weren't sure if you should block them or not. So eventually people figured out, the exception to the rule should be to allow. So by default, you're blocking everything. And then when you see something that your users or people really need to use, you allow it. So it's a much better model. Unfortunately, with data protection, the model has never been able to take that posture, which is just protect by default and then allow by exception. If you think about the DLP models, they're discover, classify, and protect. So what you're really operating under, operating under protect by default. Protect by exception. So your default is unprotect. So by definition, it's a much riskier model, the way traditional DLP has evolved. And the reason it's evolved in that way is because traditional protection mechanisms do not work at scale. So the default behavior cannot be to be protected. But with Secure Circle, your default behavior can be protected, and the exception can be to allow, which is much more in line with the way the world is going from a security perspective. You want things protected by default, and then figure out what is not important or what is allowed, and then let that happen, let that action happen. The action shouldn't be to find something bad and then block it. It should be everything should be protected, find a way to allow it to happen. That's the exception.
Yeah, and I think the challenge DLPs have had is this whole discovery classification component at scale, right? I mean, that's why you kind of saw them just at like the egress points, right? Where you could try to inspect some of those files and try to figure out whether they were critical or confidential or not, and then try to put some protection mechanisms in place. You guys kind of flipped the model upside down on its head, though, and really thought about how do you create kind of a data access layer, I think what you call data access security broker concept, that kind of sits there in between the data layer that allows you to protect everything, and then from there allow certain actions to happen or not happen. Can you explain kind of that concept?
Sure. So ultimately, when an application needs to read data, it's just reading from some sort of data repository. And just talking more on the endpoint, it's a file system, right? And what we developed at Secure Circle is, as you pointed out, we call it a data access security broker. But what it is it's a transparent layer that sits between or on top of the file system that allows us to control in a device agnostic way the ability of applications on the endpoint without any change to any applications, user experience, the way they can read and write data to the device. So essentially, we can control access, or our customers, can control access to the data independent of the user of the endpoint, independent of whether that user has administrative rights. So truly, the access control is centrally managed, while the blocks that make up the data, the bytes that make up the data on the endpoint, are still local. But it does this in a way that's completely transparent and performant across an entire organization, or across your entire global organization as well.
And it's not only the endpoint. I think what we want to talk about a little bit today is how that also translates into both cloud services and SaaS applications. Because, again, data sitting in those environments aren't necessarily, like in a SaaS application, for example, a SalesForce or whatever kind of system, that's being managed by the SaaS provider. How do you put data protection controls in an environment you don't control? Same thing with cloud services. So how does that same concept then transcend into these cloud services and SaaS applications?
Sure. So what we do is really becomes a critical part of Zero Trust. So if you think of Zero Trust today, well, first off, when you think of Zero Trust, that means no trust, which means you have to control everything. If you're not controlling everything, then you can never claim Zero Trust. So you have to be able to control the user, control the authentication of the user. You need to be able to control the network. You need to be able to control the device. And the missing piece is really the data. So what happens is, if you just think about, actually it's kind of interesting, just to take a step back for a moment. At one point in time, the cloud were the bad guy, right? And so we would want to find all this data that was leaving my premise and going into the cloud. And so the cloud was sort of the bad guy. But today, the cloud's the good guy, and we're trying to protect the stuff that's leaving the cloud. So overnight, somehow this transition happened where the cloud was the bad guy. Now the cloud's the good guy, and we're trying to protect the stuff that's leaving the cloud, right? Which I've never seen anyone really call that out, but it's sort of something interesting that happened over the last few years. So the cloud's the good guy now, and we're adopting these Zero Trust models, which means we have to have control over the device, the user, the network, and also the data. So if you think about how data DPAs are all written with your SaaS providers, they control and secure the data when it's in. So for example, SalesForce, Workday, they'll control and secure the data when it's inside Workday. But where your responsibility comes into play is once you open that front door, once you've authenticated the user, you've authenticated the device, you've made sure the network is secure, you've just opened that front door. Now the data comes out. That's where you're exposed. I mean, if you just look at your downloads folder, just look at how much stuff is in your downloads folder that came from cloud services, whether it was internal employee-facing cloud services or even external services, that downloads folder is full on a daily basis, right? So a lot of stuff is coming out of the cloud all the time. And what we do at Secure Circle is we really tie into that Zero Trust model and protect the data. Again, because we don't have to scan for PII, we don't have to scan for all that stuff, although we can do that, but we don't have to. You could just say anything that comes out of Salesforce, anything that comes out of Workday, for example, is HR data. You don't have to go through and try to find the needle in the haystack because, again, we work at scale. So we really fill that missing piece. You've authenticated the user, you've authenticated the device, or control the device, you have control of the user, you have control of the network. And now when the data inevitably leaves that service, you have control of the data now that is on that endpoint. So really what you've done is you've just transitioned that control from your cloud provider to, when you've opened that front door, now onto a device that you control and manage.
Now, my download folder is full of HubSpot download files because we use HubSpot for all of our activities with our sponsors, etc. So I know exactly what you're talking about. My downloads folder is full of downloaded stuff from HubSpot because I use that to work with our sponsors. So now if I have Secure Circle in place, I can protect those downloaded PDF files, etc., put some protections around those because they're now out of HubSpot, and give me that a level of protection of at least that customer PII data that I would have in my download file, for example.
Right, but if we're not protecting the downloads folder, keep in mind, the context is the service. So really, if you think of classification, it's really a coarse-grained classification. I'm protecting everything that comes out of this SaaS service, whether it's Workday, whether it's SalesForce, whether it's ServiceNow, whether it's HubSpot. You can enforce that Secure Circle is part of that compliance posture of the device, and you're not going to be able to authenticate into, let's say, HubSpot unless Secure Circle is installed. Once you know it's installed and you've confirmed that through MDM and your SAML assertions, then clearly then the data that comes out is identified by Secure Circle as a contextual ingress point that gets protected. And again, you could now take all that data that was in your downloads folder, move it around, use it as you normally would. You can do whatever you'd like to do with that data. Use it internally just as you normally would. No limitations to what you or your user would want to do with that data. In fact, that data could even be source code downloaded from GitHub. So you can download source code from GitHub. You could do a checkout. You could do a clone, and you'd still use your IDE that of choice that you want to use. Nothing would have to change. You could build that source code as you normally would build it and check it back in.
Great. That's
so
interesting.
That code was protected by GitHub when it was in GitHub, and now it's protected by Secure Circle, or our customers of Secure Circle, once it's down on that device.
Right. So you're adding a layer of protection across that entire ecosystem. Now, somebody will ask, well, wait, don't CASBs kind of do this? What's different about a cloud access security broker, for example, versus what you guys are doing at Secure Circle?
Sure. So CASB will sit in the middle, reverse proxy, forward proxy, whether it's a secure web gateway, they're all kind of blurring together. And CASB providers are adding DLP, but it's really DLP light, right? So what CASBs do when it comes to DLP, it's let me look for the stuff that's maybe leaving a cloud service for PII. And if it is, I'll encrypt it. Maybe I add rights management. I'll do something. But again, it's the mode of operation where the exception is to protect, right? CASBs aren't universally applying protection and giving you the control over the data that's leaving, which is data you previously had complete control of when it was in that SaaS service, right? So why not continue that control, that same level of control, once it leaves? And that can't be done because those tools, as I mentioned earlier, just don't work at scale. You have to be very selective in how you apply them.
Yeah, I've never been a big fan of CASBs because I think it's really difficult to take the internet, connect it to the internet, and connect it through this little straw, right? You create this
Something
pinch
feels
point.
very unnatural about the whole thing. I mean, I'm not, it feels relatively unnatural. I mean, I do believe the federated approach with SAML is feels to me anyway, a much more natural fit for how you want to protect your cloud services. Basically, you have your authentication, your identity provider, and your assertions. And one of those assertions can be is your device compliant. And part of your compliance posture could be EDR, of course, and Secure Circle. And once those two pieces are in place, you can guarantee that the device is hopefully clean and free of any malware. And then when the data leaves those services, it's still under your control, just as it was before it left those services. So you truly can claim zero trust. I'm not giving the users control over that data. So if you're not inserting Secure Circle, when users are pulling data down off of those services, then you're leaving it up to the user, which then means you're no longer zero trust.
Yeah. Now, what happens if through getting data out of like a HubSpot, right? What if I try to move it somewhere else? I try to copy and paste it. I try to move that data to some other system. How does Secure Circle protect that next leap of maybe trying to move that data to an unmanaged system? How do you protect against that use case?
So protection is encryption, but the encryption is just a means to an end. I mean, if you think about why anyone encrypts data today, I mean, even if I asked you, why do you encrypt data? I mean, your answer is going to be, so I can see it and no one else can see it. So ultimately, Encryption is just a means to an end, and the end is access control. So we're truly using encryption as a mechanism for access control, but we're not having to distribute keys to the end users or the end applications because we sit in the middle. Now, when that happens, again, I mentioned that since we work at scale, when anything comes out of, for example, those services, it's all going to be protected. And what we're really protecting is the data. Of course, the file itself is the control point, but it's really the data that we're protecting. So even if you, let's say, downloaded CSV file. Oh, let's use source code. Let's say you downloaded a bunch of Java out of your GitHub, and you were building it, whatever, and you thought you were going to exfiltrate some source code. So you copied, let's say, a couple kilobytes out of a file and pasted into a text file, and you think you're going to then save that text file to a USB drive and take it home with you. What we're able to do is identify binary similarity, and we'll be able to identify that amount of text that you just copied into the amount of source code you just copied into that text file is going to be similar to the text file that just got egressed out of Git, and we're going to apply that same protection, which is encryption, on creation of that file, that derivative work, as we call it. So that text file is going to be protected and encrypted, just like the source files that were downloaded out of Git. And if you take that home on your USB drive and try to plug it into a machine that's not controlled by your organization or not compliant, in other words, doesn't have Secure Circle installed, then you can have a bunch of encrypted bytes. So the data is persistently protected at rest, in transit, and even in use.
Yeah, which is a great model, right? We've always known this concept of homomorphic encryption is kind of the nirvana state for data security. You're kind of getting that same level of protection as the data is encrypted regardless. And if you don't have the right access rights or the decryption keys to read the data, then it's protected no matter where it is. So if it gets breached, guess what? The hackers can't look at it. And I think that's a really interesting concept of what you guys bring to the table.
Right. And they actually allow the organizations to even manage the application or process list that's able to read that data. And again, they're only reading the bytes they need to read at any given point in time. Just like when an application reads, it doesn't read the whole file. It'll just read a section of the file. And it's only that section that gets returned to the process that's making that request. So if it's something like malware that's trying to make a request to read that data, it's going to just read a bunch of garbage data because it's not going to be allowed, since it's not a trusted application on the endpoint. And you can enforce trust by numerous ways. You can sign processes yourself, or you can see if the process has been signed by a trusted authority like Microsoft or Apple or Adobe or something along those lines.
Yeah, it's a very interesting concept. Paul and I really like what you guys are doing. We think it's one of those areas that we definitely need more focus on in the security space, is protecting that data. And I think you guys do a really fantastic job of that.
Well, thank you, man.
Thank you, Jeff, for joining me. If anybody wants to get a demo or a free 30-day trial, you can visit securityweekly.com/secure circle. Jeff, thank you for joining me for this interview segment.
Thank you very much.
And with that, we'll take a break, but we'll come back soon with more interviews at Virtual Hacker Summer Camp.